Oh, I hope everyone's doing great on this lovely, what day is it? Tuesday. We will be having guest Vitale Buford with us today, who will be talking about perfection and the pursuit of perfection and how sometimes the pursuit of perfection keeps us from so many other worthy and perhaps even more incredible, meaningful, and impactful goals. So we will be having her on shortly. If any of you guys tuning in have experiences with perfection and have any questions you would like to ask, feel free to write them in the chat. Actually, I should pin. Okay, perfect, Vitale. There's somehow, oh yeah, you got it. You requested. Okay, here we go. How do I accept you? We going live. All right, here we go. Hello, how are you? Let me turn up my volume.
I'm super excited.
Awesome. I'm going to just throw a quick comment in here.
Okay.
On the comment box. It's going to say perfectionism.
Yes.
And then I can pin that somehow. I'm not savvy. Let's see.
We're both wearing our glasses, so we look very studious.
Good, I know. Yes, I'm hiding like half of my face, which is always useful. Thank you so much for joining us. I was just
Thank you for inviting me.
looking up quotes about perfection, and one of the ones that I liked the most was, "Excellence does not require perfection." And I felt it would almost be more suiting if there was another sentence that says, "In fact, perfection makes excellence practically impossible."
Right.
And so we're here to talk about a bunch of different things, but perfection and the pursuit of perfection and how that often keeps us from so many other things, whether it be in our relationships, our careers, or with ourselves. And so I'd love to just have you start by introducing yourself and a bit about yourself. And then maybe we can hop into, the different types of perfection, it was really funny. This morning I was listening to one of your solo pieces, and I don't know why, but for some reason the word perfectionism to me is something that I immediately turn away from. I think, I don't know what that is, or that's this conceptual faraway thing that I don't relate to. Yet when you were speaking, there were so many things that I related to, and you'd be like, there's this type of perfection, there's this type, and I'd be like, oh yeah, and when you have both of those types. So particularly in a work setting. So I'm really excited to learn more. I'll pass it over to you, but yeah, I'm really excited to learn more and share this with everyone tuning in.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Thank you for having me. And, that's why I talk about perfectionism, because a lot of us are like, oh, that's not me. I'm not
Totally.
a perfectionist, but actually most of us are. And for me, so I'm Vitale Buford, and I'm the Imperfectionist, and I'm a coach, I'm a speaker, and I'm an author. And I struggled with a 10-year addiction to Adderall and a lifelong addiction to perfectionism. And it wasn't until I started my healing journey 6 years ago that I realized how much perfectionism holds us back. And in fact, I believe it's the most pervasive thing holding us back in our relationships, from our dreams and our careers. And, for me, I'm talking about the deep-rooted, the deep roots of perfectionism. Not, I need to have the perfectly clean car, or, the perfectly organized desk. Symptoms of perfectionism, of the deep perfectionism, is, the approval seeking and people pleasing, indecision, fear of failure, obsessive thinking, unrealistic expectations, anxiety, feeling stuck, avoiding conflict, not showing up as our true selves for fear of being abandoned. And until we recognize, wow, look how perfectionism is showing up. I'm indecisive. I procrastinate. I'm constantly people pleasing. I have unrealistic expectations. Until we can kind of get aware of that and say, wow, perfectionism is showing up for me, then we start healing it, and then we take massive, massive action toward our dreams.
How would you define, well, first of all, I'll go back a bit more into your personal story. You said you were kind of striving for perfection,
Right.
an addiction to perfectionism. And I'm wondering, I guess, how at that time you would have defined it and what, looking back, it was that you were actually striving for. Because I'm assuming it was never about the perfection, which, because it doesn't even exist. It was about something bigger or perhaps smaller, but something totally different. So I'm curious what it was you think you were striving for.
So I think for me, I was striving for self-worth, right? So to sum up, perfectionism is when we hustle for our self-worth, be it through people-pleasing or unrealistic expectations. And so for me, it showed up as someone who I was a workaholic, so I was working 7 days a week. I had a very extremely successful corporate career on the outside, and then I was extremely thin. And I thought those two things were going to give me happiness. So the Adderall addiction allowed me to be thin. It also allowed me to work all the time. And I thought I needed those things to be perfect. But really, my Adderall addiction was just a symptom of my perfectionism. Like my need to be thin was a symptom of my perfectionism. And really, it's when we look to things outside of ourselves to feel worthy.
And so while you were kind of striving for self-worth, what do you think it is you were running away from? What do you think you were most afraid of?
I think running away from my feelings, feeling too much, right, as a human, because to look at the things about myself, as a perfectionist. I'm a recovering perfectionist now, but still perfectionism comes up for me. But as a perfectionist, I didn't when personal criticism, I looked at as a failure. I didn't look at it as information, where now if someone criticizes me, A, it's more of a reflection of them than it is me, but B, it's something I could get curious about. I was just so afraid that someone would abandon me or that someone wouldn't like me and that would reveal how unworthy I felt about myself.
Yeah. And so in that kind of, one of the things you mentioned throughout these different symptoms of perfectionism was kind of the unrealistic expectations. And I'm curious how, I think this one is a bit difficult sometimes to get perspective and to even figure out if we have realistic or unrealistic expectations. I recently was talking to a friend and I was voicing my frustration about how every day I only get a very small fraction of all the things that I want to get done and feel as though I should. And in my head, it's always been like, oh, because I know I'm capable of a lot, and perhaps these other things that get in the way or why I'm not achieving them, I get distracted doing other things, other work things as well. But it was just so interesting because she had this moment where she looked at me and she said, do you ever think that maybe we all just think we're more capable of than we're actually capable of? And it was just the most simple thing ever. And I looked at her and I said, I think you might be onto something there. But that thought had never occurred to me before.
Right, but it's, again, we use our task list as a measure of our worth.
And so how do you even recognize, okay, this is, the blurry line between realistic and unrealistic in terms of my expectations, my hopes, goals, because there's, the whole thing, dream big. I swam D1 in college, and you always were supposed to set goals bigger than yourself. And if you were easily achieving your goals, you weren't setting them big enough. And so that didn't help you measure progress. It didn't push you, and you weren't gonna kind of get to any level of excellence. And so how do you kind of integrate ambition with, realistic expectations and kind of self-worth and appreciation?
Yeah, so for me, it's the difference between love and fear, right? Striving for excellence comes from love. Striving for perfectionism comes from fear. And so if you set a goal, it's just worth asking yourself, like, is this goal coming from love or fear? Am I setting this goal because I'm afraid that if I don't achieve this, other people will judge me? Or I need to achieve this to please, a certain type of, I need to please someone.
Yeah.
And so you can just take some time, and early on it may be hard to decipher, is it love or fear? But just asking yourself that question, like, am I doing this because I know I'm capable of greatness, that I deserve success, that I'm worthy of achieving my dreams? Or is it, well, I got to set this because, X influencer on social media is doing this, so I need to do it.
How would you try and define perfection?
Yeah, so I believe that perfection is when we are looking outside of ourselves for love and self-worth. It's when we outsource our self-worth and our self-trust to things and people and places outside of ourselves.
Yeah. And so in kind of going back a bit into the different types of perfection, I guess, how does it do good versus bad? Should we get rid of it completely? Are there certain ways or contexts or use cases in which it is helpful? Where's the balance between the good and the bad that it does?
Right. So I believe that perfection is this lens in which we view the world, and it actually is a filter for all of our interactions. So when we are striving for perfection, we're never present, because we're always thinking like, well, I'm not enough, or, we might be like, I could be on this Instagram live right now with you, and I wouldn't be paying attention to you, and I wouldn't be present because I'd be thinking about the next thing I need to achieve, or I'd be comparing myself, or I would just, I wouldn't be present. And so for me, it's about, sorry, I'm like going off on a tangent. I'm like, let me take it back.
That's what we're here for.
But perfectionism, like what I believe is, okay, so if you put 2 fingers in your ribs right now,
where
and you try to speak to me, like literally put 2 fingers in your ribs and try to speak to me.
Yeah.
That's perfectionism.
Okay.
Right? Like it's informing all of your decisions.
Yeah. It's just kind of a lingering discomfort.
Right. It's a distraction that we're not aware of. It's like the subconscious, it's a subconscious lens and filter in which that informs all of our decision making, right? Like, I'm not good enough. Let me question my decisions. How do I make this decision? Is it the perfect decision? Did I make the right decision? Obsessive thinking one thing and then just going down a rabbit hole. Well, let me overthink this to death, and then I'll find the perfect answer. Anxiety, a symptom of perfectionism. Let me procrastinate. I got to wait for the perfect moment to start this project, my business, my book. This, avoiding this difficult conversation. And so we don't know that these fingers are in our ribs.
Yeah.
And when I do a lot of public speaking, everyone's able to do the exercise, and I can demonstrate it better than I can on Instagram Live. But when you heal your perfectionism, you take the fingers out of your ribs.
Right. Well, for anybody tuning in, give it a try. And I can see how it's kind of that, it's something I think you would habituate to, but not in a good way, in a way that it just is always there and becomes part of you, and you perhaps stop noticing it, but it's still the first thing filtering your thoughts and behaviors.
Right. It's like, of course I would question a decision I've made. I've always questioned it. Of course I'm going to, feel resistance or procrastinate. I always do that. Of course I'm going to compare myself to someone else. I always do that. Yeah.
You just kind of adjust, and exactly, it's that lens. So you even stop noticing how you used to see the world or how other people might see it, and how seeing it differently could perhaps change a lot of things. I wanted to talk about how, and you kind of mentioned it just there, but before we get into perfectionism in relationships, how does perfectionism actually, I don't want to say lead to imperfection, because imperfection is everything, but how does seeking perfectionism actually kind of hinder us or do damage probably and become kind of counterproductive? It almost seems ironic, because in seeking all of that, we have to compromise so many other things. We miss opportunities, we miss connections, whatever it is. And so that seeking of is exactly what keeps us from, excellence.
Right. Well, perfection is a fantasy, and it's also this like a constant moving target. So we think, well, once I have this car, I'll feel better. Once I have this amount of income, I'll feel better. Once I have this relationship, I'll feel better. And the more we chase perfectionism, the further we get away from ourselves. Like, the more we create a gap between our intuition and ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we don't know who we are, because we've been looking to other people to tell us who we are for all of our lives.
Right.
And then deep perfectionism, really a lot of it's born in our childhood. We start people pleasing at a young age and we get praised for it. We take on other people's stuff, it's like we get praised for being the perfect child and, being self-motivated and getting great grades. And we're like, well, that's what I get praised for. I'm going to continue to follow that praise. That praise feels good.
It's so interesting, because I think these are things that at the same time, with everything in life, and particularly in psychology and in relationships, there are things that are good up to a certain point and then beyond a certain point become damaging. So when you are raising a child, for example, how would you know when to kind of pull back the reins and not be putting on too much pressure? Or in a relationship, with somebody else, or in friendships. I remember when a friend of mine was signed up for a trail run half marathon, and they didn't even like running, and he hadn't done many races. And so it came to the day of, and he hadn't trained at all. And along the way, I had tried to offer guidance. And in my family, you make up a training plan and you check in, and there's accountability, or on sports teams. And so I had tried to take on that, what I knew, and offer that as what I saw being positive encouragement. But what this person felt suffocated by and hated and totally rejected, to the point where then I couldn't even ask about the race itself. He never did train for it, and the race ended up getting canceled because of rain and mudslides, and then it was rescheduled, and then I think he ended up canceling it again because he never trained. But it was this really, really huge moment for me, because my family tends to have a level of, we'll call it, constructive criticism or motivation, that I think in our heads is, I know you're capable of so much, so I'm going to push you so you can be everything I believe you can be. And that is meant to be positive. But, I know from experience, it's also extremely destructive and not sustainable and very difficult. But that for me was a huge moment several years ago, when I began to notice, I have absorbed this, I have taken this on myself, and this is an issue not only for this other person, for other people in general, but has been an issue for me. I do this to myself.
Right, which is like, I need you to be happy for me to be happy, so let me give you this training plan so you feel on track and then I feel on track.
Well, no, it was more just like pushing yourself was supposed to be kind of it was meant to be like a compliment.
Yeah.
Like, you're capable of so much, and I know you can do more, versus putting too much pressure on yourself and being too, I don't know, critical, or I don't know, just not being able to be okay with, walking the whole race or just going.
Right, but then also letting that person have their own experience.
Yeah. That's
again, like
true.
with perfectionism, it's like, no, I want you to have the experience that I think you should have, and that's going to make me feel okay. It's related somewhat to people pleasing, and there's nothing, I'm definitely like it's a form of like codependency, right? Like not good or bad, they're all learned behaviors. Like for me, one of the biggest things was like learning to only give advice when asked.
Yeah.
I used to be someone that was like, well, let me tell you how to do this. And it was like, no one asked you, Vitale. And it's like, so for me, like I've really adopted that. Now I'm a coach. So in my coaching role, it's a little different.
Yeah.
But when it comes to friends and family and non-coaching clients, like I only give advice when asked because I was so conditioned, like I need you to feel this way for me to feel this way. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'd never thought of the people pleaser thing. Because again, that's something on the surface I wouldn't identify with at all. And I would think, if you ask people I know, they would never describe me as a people pleaser. Who knows? I don't know anything.
Well, I never thought too.
But yeah.
It's not shaming it.
Yeah.
It's not, like all of these things were learned coping mechanisms. We did these things to survive as children.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if we're talking about us as children, then never mind. People pleaser would for sure be high on the list. Or trying to keep the peace. But no, that part about the advice, too, is really interesting. And again, this all just seems to be stemming back to my family, which is not who I was thinking about as I was preparing for this interview. But that kind of, unsolicited advice, but again, that is meant to help or share input or perspective, but that can kind of come across in the wrong way. And I actually have talked in the past about, the difference between curiosity and criticism. When you want to learn about somebody's training plan or somebody's career plan or, at what stage of life they're in or their company, there's a big difference and a thin line between curiosity and criticism.
Right.
So kind of segueing into relationships and romantic relationships and partnerships, as I touched on kind of that perfection kind of making more imperfection inevitable, I would love for you to kind of share your personal stories in your relationship. And you had kind of mentioned how there was this one line about, because I was unworthy, I attracted people who were unworthy, which I just wanted to say loud and clear for anybody who's listening, because I thought that piece was just so sound and I think is a huge, often overlooked, there is the line, we attract the love we think we deserve, but it's so much more complicated than that. And so I'd love to hear a bit about that, but then also about how you're kind of trying to create these perfect relationships were ones that you actually ended up straying from and kind of, well, you mentioned some of the affairs, but more just the fact that as you were pushing harder towards something, at the same time, in the sake of that perfection, it, created more kind of, I don't want to use the word errors, but just kind of forced you away from what you were going for even more.
Right. So for me, the theme with me, like in my history of relationships and perfectionism, is I constantly looked for someone else to validate me. In fact, my history of relationships is I cared more what the person thought about me than what I thought about that person. And I didn't know any other way to operate, right? Like I thought, like, oh, you like me, that means I'm worthy. Like, and I want to get more of that. So, of course, I'm going to stay in this relationship because your thoughts of me make me worthy, and that worthiness is what I'm trying to go for. And so I stay in a relationship that's unhealthy because I'm using these signals of like, I need you to tell me if I'm worthy, even if it's dysfunctional. And so I would stay in like really dysfunctional relationships. And it was because I didn't know myself. I was outsourcing my self-trust and my self-love. Like, I allowed other people, like the men in my life, to be the expert in me instead of me being the expert of me. You know, like I posted a quote yesterday, and it's kind of the theme that I've been on lately, but it's, you know, my worth sits in my choice of me, not in your choice of me.
And do you think what you use the word kind of dysfunctional, I'd love if you could give a few examples of kind of what it was you were overlooking or refusing to see, which is another quote from one of your interviews. I can't remember it exactly, but it was, I see in you what I refuse to see in myself.
That was the line that got me sober. Yeah, I see in you what I refuse to see in me. And I think a lot of times we'll pick things apart in other people, and we'll say, I don't like that about this person, but really that's what's going on with us. So for example, in my current relationship, which we're in an interesting place, we're on a break right now, so it's an interesting time to be talking about relationships and perfectionism. But for a while, I was pointing the finger at him that he wasn't committed in the relationship, and that he was in and out and not committed and not consistent. And I was like, I'm actually the one that's not committed in this relationship. Like, I'm pointing, and I mean, there may be some truth to him not being committed, but at the end of the day, like, I'm responsible for the lane that I occupy, no one else's lane. And so for me, it was like, oh my goodness, like, whenever we're pointing the finger, you know, at someone else, we need to be pointing it back at ourselves. And that's that part about curiosity that you were talking about. Like, true transformation happens when those fingers that we're pointing at other people, we look at, like, what is that a reflection of happening with me?
I love that about whenever we're pointing the finger at someone else, we need to be pointing it back at ourselves. And it's just an opportunity,
but again, as perfectionists, we're afraid. We want to point the finger at the other person because, again, to point that finger at ourselves, we think reveals all this unworthiness. But honestly, all it reveals is an opportunity to change a pattern and heal and evolve.
Yeah. And going back to kind of your previous relationships that you mentioned were dysfunctional, and how kind of that approval from the other person was what kept you in it. What were the things you were overlooking? What were the things that other people should, you know, be on the lookout for themselves to recognize as unhealthy? And where and how could you have sought that elsewhere? And even if perhaps in the beginning, you know, people can't go straight from relying on other people to give them, you know, approval and to give them validation, but at the very least to not be looking for that in the wrong people.
Yeah. I think so often we will go to any length to avoid abandonment. And abandonment is a wound from my childhood. I grew up in a house with an alcoholic mother, 2 workaholic parents. I was alone a lot. So emotional abandonment was a theme. And so that's another reason why, like, that's why I chose perfectionism to cope. Because they didn't abandon me, or they were, you know, praising me when I was perfect. And so I learned very, like, young, like, okay, to be perfect is to avoid abandonment. And so I carried that over in my relationships. Right? So that means I would avoid having difficult conversations because I couldn't control the outcome. I didn't want to appear imperfect, right? I wanted to be the cool girlfriend. I also, because I had been outsourcing my self-worth for so long, I didn't trust myself. I didn't know if what I felt was right or if the other person was right. And so, for example, when I got sober, the guy that I had been with was an alcoholic. And now, he didn't call himself that, but he was drinking every day and on the weekends. And for me, I was like really trying to rationalize it. I was like, you know, like maybe I don't need to have such a big, you know, like I just need to get over it. Like, it's not a big deal that he drinks. Mm-hmm. Like, it's probably you're overly sensitive, Vitale, because you're newly sober, blah, 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 blah. Well, the bottom line is I grew up in an alcoholic household and I'm sober myself. And so the lens in which I view the world it's different. And so it's okay for me to not want to be in a relationship with an alcoholic. It's almost like just giving yourself permission to feel how you feel. Like, oh, I don't like that. That doesn't feel right. I have anxiety over this. And listening to ourselves. So often, our body gives us signals through anxiety, that pit in our stomach, and we ignore it and we override it with our mind.
Yeah, so often ignoring kind of that gut instinct or intuition for logic that we invent. You said to be perfect is to avoid abandonment was kind of what you, the mindset that you had. And so just wanted to bring up again the fact that, because I think for a lot of people kind of seeking that validation, particularly in the dating context, in the dating landscape, kind of when other people don't respond, or we don't get the response we're looking for, then we kind of seek to change something about ourselves or about the way we answer or about, what we're saying, et cetera, or about the way we react even, versus thinking, oh, this isn't about me. Because if I have to change who I am and the way I talk or the way I act and filter myself for this other person, then that isn't going to work. That's not, I don't want to use the word right person because there is no one right person, but that is not a good person for you. That shouldn't even be who you are kind of going after. If you, from the beginning, kind of have to be double, questioning everything you're saying and thinking, or changing certain things, or filtering yourself.
Yeah. So I think one of the things, like the mantra or phrase that really saves me when it comes to relationships is, I cannot miss out on what's meant for me. I cannot miss out on what's meant for me.
That would be, that's so difficult, because on one hand, that would be the most liberating mantra ever. And at the same time, you don't want to kind of hedge the responsibility onto someone else or onto fate or all of that, and kind of say, oh, I don't need to put forward the work or the effort or the self-reflection to improve my relationships and all of that. But how would you say you could kind of find the middle ground, and how did you channel, or how could other people kind of channel that mantra?
For me, I can't miss out on what's meant for me means unattached from the outcome. Be yourself. It doesn't mean sit on the couch and Netflix and wait for, Oprah to put your book on her book list. It's about, taking action, but detaching from the outcome. As perfectionists, we get so attached to the outcome. I got to have that outcome to feel worthy. I've got to have this, I need to have that person respond to my text to feel good. And again, it's about, when we, in dating, when we are, that person doesn't respond, again, we're allowing our worth to be their choice. When we choose our worth, when our worth is our choice, I'm worthy because I'm worthy, then that person not responding is a reflection of them and not us.
Yeah.
And it's always a reflection of them. But we take it personally when we're stuck in perfectionism mode, when we're stuck in unworthiness.
And kind of, you had mentioned that example of the person you were dating who had a relationship with alcohol that kind of made you uncomfortable, particularly when you were trying to recover from addiction. And just thinking about how, you viewed it through a different lens. And so perhaps even if there wasn't something that made him uncomfortable or anybody else uncomfortable about his relationship with alcohol, the fact that it did make you uncomfortable, isn't invalid. That was a fact, and that was what you were feeling. And so recognizing that, particularly in terms of the other person's response and receptiveness, that they are able to recognize what lens you are viewing things through, what experiences you have been through, and able to at least, validate your feelings as being valid because they exist. And even if it's not about, who needs to change behavior or why, but that they can recognize that that's important, that you feel that way. And it's important for them.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, let people have their experience. It's like your friend. Sorry, I got to strike my phone. It's real life,
Oh, no worries.
Right here. So it's about allowing people to have their experience and allowing yourself to have your experience. He is allowed to drink whenever he wants to drink. And I am allowed to not be okay with it. I wasn't allowing myself to be okay with it because I was so afraid of abandonment, right? That abandonment means I'm imperfect, which, at the end of the day, no one can abandon us. The only person that's abandoning us is ourselves. We abandon ourselves, like I'm abandoning myself by staying in a relationship with someone who drinks in a way that I don't agree with.
How would you define abandonment?
Oh, gosh.
I love operational definitions. Because it's just so interesting because we talk about these things, it comes up. We all have a definition we associate with that. Probably none of us ever stop to think about what our definition is, let alone the fact that we probably have very different definitions of it.
I've never actually thought about the definition of abandonment, but that's really, really good question. I would say it's, I believe that no one can abandon you without your consent, meaning at the end of the day, like abandonment really isn't even a thing. It's when we give people the power to, again, determine our worth. So them leaving us or their potential to leave us means we're unworthy.
Right. It's more about how we let their actions make us feel due to the way that we are looking and feeling in relation to the power dynamics or the kind of worthiness. But mostly, yeah, I'd say that the power dynamics and love, I think, comes into it a lot.
Right.
But again, it's that whole, if you're feeling abandoned by somebody because, they have chosen to leave, and that love that you have lost, again, if somebody is choosing to leave you, and there are so many different contexts and examples and levels, but in some cases where I think that just means we were trying to believe there was a certain type of love, or trying to, at the very least, trying to manifest a version of that relationship that wasn't, or at least now is not there, and probably won't be.
Right. And it's, using that relationship, like you staying, like you, even if it's not healthy, even if I'm in an unhealthy relationship, just being in a relationship makes me, like using that as this, barometer for worthiness.
Yeah.
And then you leaving is a barometer for my unworthiness. But the thing is that the only one abandoning myself is me. Yeah.
And you earlier mentioned that you are a recovering perfectionist.
Yes.
And so I would love for you to just share a bit. You've kind of alluded to a few different things, but some of the most practical things you learned or put into use, and some actionable advice perhaps for anybody else out there who knowingly or unknowingly might be seeking to become a recovering perfectionist themselves one day.
So for me, being a recovering perfectionist means that perfectionism no longer runs my life. So those fingers are no longer in my ribs 24/7. Now, they make, it also means that perfectionism will still crop up for me, and it always will, because it was a deeply rooted childhood coping mechanism. But it doesn't run my life. So now I know when it comes up for me, and I can say, I see you, perfectionism, and you're not going to run my day-to-day. Mm-hmm. And so 2 things that people can do to start healing their perfectionism is, 1, by becoming a curious observer. So that list of symptoms that I listed off earlier, and a lot of these symptoms are also on my Instagram profile, because I've created a bunch of infographics around it. Oh, cool. But, like indecision, fear of failure, comparison, procrastination, people-pleasing, avoiding conflict. So first it's about getting clear, like, where do these symptoms show up in my life? And then instead of shaming ourselves, being like, that's interesting, I wonder why I do that. It's about showing yourself compassion. So when you can just get curious, because what happens is we'll feel jealousy, for example. Our friend gets a promotion and we feel jealous. We don't feel excited. We don't feel happy. We're jealous of them. And then what happens as perfectionists, we then judge that feeling. I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible friend. I'm never happy for anyone. Of course I'm jealous. And we obsess over it, and it builds and it builds and it builds. But when we can approach jealousy with curiosity, so, I feel jealous of my friend. I guess that means maybe I need to dream bigger. Maybe that's an indication that I need to ask for a promotion in my job. Oh, this is revealing that I want more for my life. When you can get curious about those things, like, I'm struggling making a decision. Or I'm people pleasing. When you can just start getting curious, like, how is that showing up for me? How is this a pattern? Is it a pattern in my career, in my relationships, all of the above?
Yeah.
Start getting curious. When you become an outside observer and a curious observer instead of this, like, internal, like, judger, critical, person, you can then start healing it. And then I would say another way to heal your perfectionism, and the way that I went for it, because people pleasing and codependency was a theme for me. And so what I did is I went on an advice detox. I stopped asking anyone for advice. So what I would do is I would, like, call 8 friends. Like, if there was something I was struggling with in an intimate relationship, or a decision I needed to make in my career, I would literally phone 10 friends and, like, poll them. Yeah. And I would get all caught up in the drama of it. Let's talk it over. Let's talk about it. Even though I knew deep down what the answer was, but I, again, didn't trust my decisions at the time because I was such a perfectionist. But, like, what I did is I stopped asking for advice. Like, every time I wanted to pick up the phone, I would put it down.
Yeah.
And now there's healthy input and there's advice, but we typically know the difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Because sometimes talking things out, even if it's just as a sounding board, sometimes you realize that you know the answer as you are defending one thing versus the other, or talking to somebody, hearing it out loud. You think, oh, actually, I guess I already made that decision. But that's really interesting, particularly because beyond, 1 or 2 people, you inevitably get so much conflicting advice, so much confusion, and then there's just too much noise, and then there's just kind of paralysis from.
And a lot of times we know what the thing is to do, and it's typically the uncomfortable thing. It's typically the hard thing, but we're like, maybe I can pull 8 of my friends, and they will disagree with me,
and they will tell me to do the easy thing.
Even though, because here's the thing, it's about our integrity. At the end of the day, are we in integrity with ourselves? When we say no to something, and we feel that no, but then everyone else around us is yes, we're out of integrity if we're not going with what we think we need to do. Yeah. And again, there's healthy input from coaches, from trusted advisors, from therapists, whatever. But, we typically know if we're being honest with ourselves when we're crossing that line.
Yeah.
Or at least I know when I'm crossing that line. I'm like, oh, there I go again. Bring it back in, Vitale.
Yeah. Yeah. And how what were the biggest, as you kind of talked about these 3 different ways people can help themselves recover, move away from perfectionism and into more self-awareness, curiosity, self-growth, and kind of empowerment?
Yeah.
What were the biggest changes you saw in your life? What areas of your life specifically kind of saw the most impact from making those changes?
Yeah. So I would say, like, one of the mantras I live my life by is done is better than perfect. And so I would say I have taken action on my dreams by striving to be myself, my imperfect, like, whole self. So what I mean by that is I left corporate America with no savings as a single parent because I was, just This is what I'm meant to do. I'm meant to be a coach. I'm meant to do this on my own. I'm going to do it imperfectly. I wrote and published my memoir by imperfectly doing it. If I had been stuck in a perfectionist mode, I'd still be talking about my book, and it would never get done. Let me just be honest, because memoir, like, it was super triggering to write my story.
Yeah. And your story's never done. It would literally be impossible to write a perfect story, which is already impossible, about a story that will never be finished in itself, let alone the story about the story.
Right. So I would say done is better than perfect. Not letting perfection getting in the way of progress, not believing that there's like a perfect time. Like for me, when I was writing my book, I was like, this is what's true for me right now. This is what's true for me right now. The second thing is just allowing yourself to be human and evolve. When I started my business, everyone was like, well, what are you going to call it? And what's the website going to look like? And it needs to be blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I'm calling it Vitale Buford Coaching. It may change in a few years, but we just need to get started. Yeah. I'm just going to get a website up. And the website that I currently have is like the second or third iteration. So it's just about, I didn't step into my imperfectionism niche until I would say the last quarter of 2019, where I was like, all right, I'm going to fully own this. And it's because I allowed myself to evolve. Mm-hmm. We find out what we like, who we are, because we're evolving. And then I think too, the third thing is really giving myself permission, being the expert of me. Like that quote that I shared earlier, where it's like, my worth sits in my choice of me, not in your choice of me. I just, for so long, outsourced my self-love and my self-trust to everyone outside of me. Bosses, coworkers, friends, family, lovers, all of it. And I looked to them for worthiness, and I made it their responsibility. And so to make me the one who's responsible for my self-worth has been a huge game changer. Mm-hmm.
And must feel amazing.
Yeah, and I'm not done. All of us are, there's always layers. There's always one other thing. It's like, oh my gosh, I thought I was over this. No, clearly not. Yeah. So it's, just giving yourself that space, and doing the work and doing the hard stuff. This growth game is not easy. But staying the same is harder.
Yeah. Doing this growth game is difficult, but staying the same is harder. Yeah. I love that. And as we get ready to wrap up, I think these last few things really echoed the idea that imperfection makes life beautiful. And it's through imperfection and living that more authentic side of ourselves that allows for more appreciation of what's around us, moments, connections with other people that wouldn't be possible with those same filters there, particularly if, some people are also kind of, I can't even think of the word I'm looking for, but putting that onto other people, those same expectations, those same criticisms, and kind of holding other people to the same unhealthy standard and kind of invalid value system. And so the ways that imperfection makes life beautiful, and how perfection, besides, being non-existent, not being real, it would be boring, because it implies it's static. It doesn't imply the same growth and the same learning and evolution that is inherently necessary to us as humans, who are constantly changing, not only in who we are, but the circumstances around us, a pandemic that can come out of nowhere, all these things, everything is constantly in flux, and we need to be agile, adaptive, learning, growing humans, and perfection, there's no room for that. There's no room for that growth and for kind of appreciation of simple things, of imperfect things, and kind of that, which brings us joy and makes life more beautiful.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored. Thank
That
you.
was wonderful, and I hope everybody tuning in now or later can really use this as a chance to reflect on their own experiences and mindsets, and the source through which they are finding worth and appreciation for themselves and others. So thank you so much, and I look forward to chatting again soon.
Yeah, take care. Thank you.
See ya.